Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to try an experiment. I'm going to try and use up some paint that's left on my palette. It needs cleaning out because I was painting with colours that I don't normally use. And there's quite a lot of those colours left on my large enamel tray that I use as a palette. So rather than just wasting them and cleaning the palette off, I'm going to mix everything together that's left on my palette, and I'm assuming, because I've done this before, it will give me an interesting sort of neutral grey, green, brown or some sort of colour, depending on what the colours are that I'm mixing together. So I'm just using my large Harkey brush and plenty of water just to mix up this colour, and as you can see, is sort of a greeny brown, quite a nice earthy colour, nice and neutral. And this is Saunders Waterford cold pressed 140-pound paper, quarter imperial size. It's taped to my board. My board's at an angle of about 45 degrees, and I'm using a large goat hair calligraphy brush. The paper is dry, but I'm just picking up this neutral mix that I've made on the palette out of all those colours, which I will list in the description below. Excuse me. And I'm just literally putting a fairly weak mixture of that across the dry paper with plenty of wet paint in order to create some clouds. I'm leaving some little white areas because that will give me sort of hard edges to the clouds, and I'm touching the brush into the paint in other areas, which will give me my soft edges to the clouds. The idea is that with this colour, it's inspired me to do a sort of one of those winter skies where it's just sort of grey, green clouds that are kind of chasing across the sky on a windy day. Now I brought it down paler towards the horizon, and now I'm going to get a bit of dark shadow into it, picking up some of the darker sort of, I think it's sepia that's left on my palette. Even though I've mixed up a lot of the colours that were on the palette, there's still some individual little blobs of nice loose paint that I can now pick up and use or add to if I want. I'm just adding the cloud shadows with this sort of brown colour. Maybe there's a bit of Payne's grey in there, a bit of indigo too, just around underneath the clouds. All this paint is still wet, so as I add this paint that's a kind of slightly richer mixture, darker mixture, it's diffusing nicely into the clouds and giving them a bit of shape and a bit of form, sort of a bit of a 3D-ness, sort of perspective to the sky, if you know what I mean. Now, keeping it as simple as possible, using the large brush, I'm just going to use the same neutral colour to sweep sort of shallow diagonals across the horizon, leaving some dry brush areas, and just try and sort of build up a bit of a landscape, because I've got in mind that I want to paint a sort of deserted, desolate creek area with a broken jetty. Darkening up that corner to start establishing the creek. I think I don't want all that white patch there in the sky, so I'm just going to fill that in there whilst trying to sort of establish a little bit of a horizon line as well. Now I've added some fresh Payne's grey and sepia to my palette, and I'm using my large Chinese Harkey brush, and it's just a cheap generic brush that I found on eBay, nothing special, no brand or anything. I'm just pulling that across to add some dark areas to the land and to start to bring in some distant tree lines. I want to keep this very, very loose, very simple, and try and use sort of as fewer brush strokes as I can to build this picture up. And the idea with a loose painting like this is just to try and sort of really suggest the landscape rather than trying to paint it in. So I'm just trying to sort of set the scene with the angle of my brush strokes, my contrast, my lights and my darks, just to sort of build up the lay of the land, the creek, which will be running sort of diagonally across the landscape, and then coming in with the squirrel mop and softening off some of the areas, and then bringing across a diagonal sort of in the opposite kind of direction, just to enhance the sort of the shape of the land and the composition. I'm just going to use the tips of the brush there to put in my distant tree line. Nothing fancy, just getting in the rough suggestion of those distant trees and just letting the paint diffuse. Use a small calligraphy brush just to put some slightly different shaped trees in on this side in the distance. And then using this lovely small calligraphy brush, which has got a lovely point to it, and just going to add a bit more height to the trees on this side, still leaving some sort of ragged shapes and sort of gaps to imply different types of trees in that tree line. Just take those trees there off into the distance, using much paler paint and getting smaller. I think I need some just slightly larger trees on this side. So just painting them in nice and quickly so I get nice loose fresh shapes for my trees. Now with a clean damp brush, I'm just softening back underneath that tree line and just taking the tree line very lightly across further back into the distance to create my trees going off into the distance on the horizon. Now I'm going to use the corner of a plastic store card, and I'm just going to etch across through some of this thick paint just to add a little bit more texture, a bit more sort of implied detail. Just setting the scene for my old broken jetty to come across the old creek. I'm just scratching in some grasses across this bottom foreground corner, where I'll eventually get some slightly stronger plants growing up into the picture from that bottom right corner. Now I just think I need a little bit more dark here and there, so using the tips of a medium harky brush, or it might be a small one, I'm not sure, they're very similar sizes, just running some darks underneath the areas where I've scraped with the card and anywhere else that I think just needs it, just to balance up the composition and the tones a little bit more. I think that's about all I want to do to it. I think now I just need to step back and let it dry completely. Okay, right, it's dried overnight, and I have just penciled in lightly some old broken sticks running across the creek, and now I'm going to use my small Chinese calligraphy brush to paint them in across the creek. I want them nice and dark because they're going to be the focal point. Now I'm mixing up some Payne's grey and some of the sepia, so I've got a nice sort of dark, really dark bluish blackish brown. I'm just going to paint them in, making sure they don't look too even, because I want it to look like an old the remains of an old jetty or something, posts for whatever reason just sticking out of this old deserted creek. This nice dark richly pigmented paint will cover over the dark paint that's already there, so it will still show up against the dark. and then it'll show up, the poles will show up really nicely against the light as well. So I'm taking my time and making sure that the poles get slightly, excuse me, smaller as I go further back into the distance with them across the creek. Now these last ones are just going to be just tiny little dots. Now it's just going to be just a matter of finishing things off now using the Harkey brush and just some pale paint. Just going to sweep a bit more paint in just to fill in the areas of bank a little bit more. I'm not really going to do much to paint the creek. I'm just going to leave it suggested by the marks that are there already and the old sticks that kind of disappear into the mud and the remains of the water. I'm not even going to put reflections in because it's just too old and sort of marshy and boggy for that. This creek has definitely seen better days. It's just more or less just an old marsh now. Now I think we're nearly there, but just need to darken up a few areas. I think I'm just going to put some shadows into the base of this line of distant trees using the small calligraphy brush and this nice dark rich mixture, and then softening back here and there as I go with just a bit of clean water on the brush and then going back in with the darks, so that I'm bringing the darks in but they don't look too what's the word, they don't look as if they're just sort of plonked there. If I soften the line underneath where I'm painting onto the dry paper there, then it looks softer and it looks more established, if you know what I mean. Just maybe adding the hint of a tree trunk at the base, keeping it really loose. Going to put a bit more dark on this side, but there's more light from the sky hitting this side of the painting, so or this side of the scene here, so I'm making sure that I don't go quite as dark on this side as I did on the left side. I'm going to leave the very distant trees alone. I'm just using the small calligraphy brush, and again using the dark mixture of sepia and Payne's grey. I'm just going to dot in the indication of sort of plants growing over the bank on this corner in sort of dark colours. So I'm just sort of dotting in random sort of little dots and marks, grouping some together, having some separate. Just to indicate, as I say, plants, grasses, brambles growing over this side. This just helps to keep that bottom corner nice and dark, but it just gives the eye something to sort of look at and travel over, and leads towards the old broken jetty, which is our focal point and the thing that leads us into the rest of the painting, hopefully. just going to use the rigger now just to put some stalks and stems and things like that, just sort of not really bothering to join the foliage and the plants that I've done, but sort of giving an indication of that. So it's just a tangle of undergrowth really. And now just grab the flat brush just to darken off that corner. Doesn't matter what brush I use there, it's just to hand. So just darkening off that corner, and then that closes off that part of the composition. Hopefully once I peel the paper, the tape off, then that corner should look quite interesting. Final touch, just to draw attention to the clouds and the sort of direction that the clouds are travelling across the sky in, by putting some birds slightly angled, just a few slightly angled birds carefully put in, nice and small, just looking as if they're flying over this desolate landscape. Just adds a little bit of life to the painting. And I think that'll do. I think that's finished. That's as far as I want to go with this painting. So it's going to be time now to take the tape off, pulling the tape away from the painting just in case it's caught on the paper a bit. If we pull away, then if it is caught, then it won't tear into the painting, it'll tear away. Right, well now we've removed the tape and we've got a nice clean white border. I think this looks quite interesting. I think it's a good way of using up old paint on the palette, is mixing it together so that you end up with just a lovely neutral colour, which makes a really good base for interesting paintings. I think if we zoom in and have a closer look, you can see that there's plenty of dry brush, there's plenty of unpainted paper there, which serves as our lightest light. This dry brush, I think, is what suggests the muddy creek, and our jetty and suggestions of plants in the bottom corner work quite well to lead the eye across the painting and up through into the sky, where we've just got a few birds. And those distant trees, just mere suggestions. They look quite sort of desolate and windswept like that, but I'm tempted just to add a couple of thin branches just coming out using the rigger. I think I'll just do that, just a couple of branches just coming out from here. Nothing too much or too defined, not too many for sure. I don't want this to look like a manicured row of trees, and this is quite a desolate, bleak, unkempt and unloved landscape. Well, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you'll maybe give this a try. If sometimes you've got paint left on your palette and you don't want to paint with the same colours again, mix them up and see what happens, because generally whatever colours you've got, if you mix them together, you'll produce an interesting sludgy sort of earthy neutral, which can actually work really well for you. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for your support. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks so much to my lovely patrons for supporting this channel. See you soon then. Bye.